Hello and welcome to episode 95 of the official EstablishTheRun.com podcast. My name is Adam Levitan. I'm one of the co-founders here at ETR. As always, I am joined by fellow co-founder Evan Silva. I am also joined by our director of analytics, Mike Leone. And we are well aware that a ton of you have drafts coming up, so we're continuing our positional preview series, this time at the wide receiver spot. Evan, what's going on?
What's going on? Leone said he wanted to really get into it on this show, arguing about some wide receivers. He even used the term fight. We're going to fight. So I'm here to fight.
Yes. I believe DeAndre Hopkins will be a subject that we'll have to hit on here. Leone,
Indeed.
What's going on?
Not too much. I've come fully prepped to defend DeAndre Hopkins against Evan Silva's egregious attacks. So I'm excited for this podcast.
I love it. Evan's just like grinding news to find anything bad about DeAndre Hopkins. Like, he might be holding out. He might have a contract dispute. Okay. I hope you guys have already listened to the quarterback and running back versions of this show. Our goal on these shows, these 4 kind of mini series shows, is to talk about high level strategy for drafting, what we think is correct, understand some relative player values, and we will get to all that. Before we get into all that with wide receivers, I know many of you have been slacking. You have been out on Team Smell the Roses. You have been out on Team Sex. You have not been putting in the work you needed to do to get ready for the NFL season. The good news is that we can help. Our draft kit is live and continuously updating. And also our bundle package is now live. If you plan to play DFS this season, which I hope and suspect many of you do, because in my humble opinion, it's the best form of fantasy, the bundle will be by far our best offer to get the draft kit and the in-season package together for the lowest price that you can get. So head to the site to check all that out, EstablishTheRun.com. Okay, wide receivers. I want to zoom out for a second and suggest a 2-part thesis, Leone. The first part of this thesis is as more teams implement 3 wide receiver sets as a base and more teams use 4 wide receiver sets, there's simply more viable wide out options for fantasy just because more of them are on the field. And also, teams are obviously throwing at a higher rate than they did 5, 10, 15 years ago. So it appears incredibly deep. On the other hand, because there are so many more wide receivers on the field, the ones that actually do get 25+% target shares in pass-centric offenses are even more valuable. So what do you thoughts on that from a macro level, Leone, about how the way the league has gone has changed how we should address the wide receiver position in fantasy?
Yeah, that was the theory that I held until I did some research for Drew Dinkmeyer when he was writing an article for Establish the Run, looking at macro trends in the NFL. And I was surprised to see that is happening long term. If you look over the past decade, over the past 5-6 years, we're seeing a lot more passing. We're seeing more spread out attacks. But if you look within the past 5 years, like 2 years ago versus 5 years ago, it hasn't shifted that much or as much as it seems. We've seen, you talk about guys with over 25% target shares. 2015, there were 9, then there were 11, then there were 9, then there were 8, then there were 11 last year. So I think we're gradually seeing that. I think we saw a big shift around 2014, 2015, where it headed in that direction. And I expect as the NFL gets more analytics friendly for that to continue to evolve, but it is happening at a little bit of a slower pace than I feel like it's perceived. It feels like slot receivers are being used a lot more and we're getting more spread out attacks. Arizona, one of them, which will revolve around the DeAndre Hopkins talk about pass happier, but spreading it out more often. So I'm having a tough time figuring out exactly what to do with that. And it seems like this year in particular, even though we have a couple of dynamite receivers like a Michael Thomas with these huge target shares, and we don't have as many alphas like that, we do have a lot more guys around the 25% target share range or 20%, but really efficient. And we'll hit on those in that rounds 3 through 6 range.
Yeah, Evan, I think a common refrain we've heard is that wide receiver is deeper than it's ever been. And we can get into whether that's true or not, but just your initial thoughts on the wide receiver position. How deep do you think it actually goes?
Yeah, I think it's pretty deep. I mean, I think you can, you start to get like even into the 60s and you've got guys like Paris Campbell who are really interesting late. I think that there are so many candidates to finish within the top 12. I think that you could go like a solid 25 deep on wide receivers that I think are legitimate candidates to finish within the top 12. Like my wide receiver 25 is Michael Gallup, where we're actually significantly above consensus on him. Last time I checked, his FFPC ADP was wide receiver 31. But guys like Cortland Sutton, Michael Gallup, DJ Chark, Will Fuller, Marquise Brown, Devontae Parker. I mean, these guys are all consistently available in the 6th, 7th round of drafts. And, all these guys are very much in play to finish as true wide receiver ones.
We also just had an absurdly talented rookie wide receiver class get drafted in, which I think adds to the depth of the position.
For sure. Yeah, I think, and we'll get into more about how deep it really is and all that in a minute here. I do think the main theme of the wide receiver position this year, though, is these middle rounds. And because of the RB thirst that we dove into on the last episode, the wide receivers get pushed down. And so these wide receivers that are available in like rounds 4 through 8, I mean, let me read you guys some of the names who I like, who make it move for me a little bit between rounds 4 and 8. And this is the underdog ADP, rounds 4 through 8. You can get Adam Thielen, Calvin Ridley, AJ Brown, Cooper Kupp, Terry McLaurin, Tyler Lockett, DJ Chark, DK Metcalf, Will Fuller, Marquise Brown, Michael Gallup, Deontay Johnson, Henry Ruggs, Jalen Reagor, all these guys. I mean, that is ridiculous. And so what we've seen is what I think is the quote unquote optimal strategy for a home league, as we talked about in the running back episode, running backs early and then pound wide receivers through these middle kind of range here. Evan, I know you're on this middle round tier here in a big way, like I am. Are there any names there that stick out to you? And do you think that is the optimal to kind of go running back 2 out of the first 3 rounds, and then we get into big time wide receiver production in rounds 4 through 8?
No, I definitely think in home leagues, that's the way to go. Start with 2 RBs, at least 1 RB within the first 2 rounds, and then start hammering wide receivers. I think that home leagues are generally now full PPR, right? That's probably taken over home leagues. That wasn't necessarily the case 4 or 5 years ago, but I think that it has at this point. So you want to obviously build an excellent and really just, I think you can outdraft people like using our rankings. I think that our rankings are going to be better. I mean, we crushed wide receiver rankings last year relative to ADP, and I expect to do that again. You can start off with 2 RBs and just outdraft your opponents in a home league using our rankings. I think that's very, very viable.
Yeah, Leone, I know you don't want to go down the chalk path in lineup construction, but we've talked a lot about how the wide receivers in this middle rounds are so strong relative to the running backs. I would assume you agree with that. And how would you play kind of a home league setting in these middle rounds?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. It's hard for me to even pick out a favorite because of all the guys you mentioned. They all have great combinations of floor and ceiling, and the running backs in this range are all very fragile. They don't have in rounds 3 through 6. There might be an outlier here or two that we like. You wrote about Jonathan Taylor as maybe having round 1 upside, but there's a lot of guys like Leonard Fournette or, even a Todd Gurley where it's shaky. It might look good to start the season, but it's shaky, and running back is very volume dependent. And if that volume disappears for any reason, poof. But that's not going to happen for guys like Michael Gallup, who, saw almost the same target share as Amari Cooper did, and is an offense that's just full on wheels up. That's not going to happen for DJ Chark. He's going to see a huge amount of volume, and he's a very talented receiver, even without a quarterback and an offense that might not be that good. If anything, that might push them to throw quite a bit, and you have guys on teams that are just going to throw a ton. We mentioned Jared Goff and Matt Ryan on the quarterback episode, but you've got Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, Calvin Ridley in this range. So it just seems endless. It just seems like you can keep picking guy off after guy off. And even as you fall out of that 6th round tier, guys like Jarvis Landry, Christian Kirk in 7 and 8, it still kind of extends there a little bit. And in a home league, the ADP might not be as sharp, and you can take some shots on some upside guys like Marquise Brown, who in higher stakes leagues, I think people are buying into that upside a little early. In a home league, it might be a bit easier to get that upside into your lineup.
Yeah. Okay. One thing I want to talk about is relative value. Now, we just talked about all these guys that we like in rounds 3 through 8, rounds 4 through 8. But what does that mean for the guys at the top, right? Are we giving something up by saying, what's the relative value between, I don't know, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Julio Jones, who go in the first 2 rounds versus guys like DJ Chark or Calvin Ridley or Terry McLaurin or all these guys that are going significantly 2-3 rounds later. So let's talk about the top, Evan. Is it a priority for you at all to get into that Michael Thomas, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Julio Jones kind of ranges? What are you really doing? I guess the question is, what are you doing? At what point do you cut off the running back in round 1? And at what point are you okay with wide receivers in round 2?
I don't think I've taken a single first round wide receiver so far in any of my drafts, maybe one or two, but definitely prioritizing coming out of round 1 with a running back. Certainly anytime that I'm drafting within the top 7 picks, it would have to be a situation where I feel like I'm going to go zero RB, like truly go zero RB, like we did in that one Football Guys championship draft, Adam, where I'm drafting really, really, really late in the first round, probably like only on the ends, or maybe at 111. It would have to be a situation like that for me to take a first round wide receiver.
Yeah, Leone, are we ending up with not enough of these Michael Thomas, Devonta Adams, Tyreek Hill, Julio Jones types by emphasizing the middle round of wide receiver too much?
It's a really difficult conversation because, as we've seen, roster construction can tend to be more important necessarily than the players you pick, just because. And as Evan said, I think we have a big edge, and I think the edge in the players we pick kind of comes more in that middle round and valuing those guys appropriately than it does. Everyone's got Michael Thomas and Julio Jones ranked somewhat similarly. I will say, if you're picking again towards the end, even if you're picking 8th or so, if Michael Thomas drops to there is an edge that he has over other guys where you still know in round 2, maybe you get Kenyon Drake coming back, maybe Miles Sanders with this injury comes back in round 2. If you feel like you can still get a top RB, to get Michael Thomas over some of these other receivers is a pretty big deal. And you could end up in a weird spot in round 2. That 8th spot is, I feel like, it's the worst in the draft, because let's say you panic and you take the running back and then Devontae Adams, Michael Thomas go. You could end up in a really weird spot in round 2. So I don't mind at around 8-9 starting to think about Thomas and Devontae Adams.
Yeah. Okay. When I mentioned those first and second round wide receivers, you'll notice I did not mention DeAndre Hopkins. I want to let Leone go first in this debate, and we can talk about from a math perspective why you think Evan is undervaluing DeAndre Hopkins a little bit, despite moving to a new team, flatter target share, and all the arguments
holding
that
out, being injured.
Holding out, being injured.
So, I mean, the argument for DeAndre Hopkins is, one, as far as pure talent, top 5 receiver in the NFL, maybe a top 3 receiver in the NFL.
I didn't know you were on Team Watch the Tape, Leone.
Team Grind the Tape. Team Grind the listening to people who are better at watching the tape than me and assuming their opinions are correct. But the target shares he's seen, 30+% guy, you mentioned those guys, there might not be as many of them as we move forward in the NFL. Now, he's not going to see that with Arizona because they're more spread out. I concede that point, but I also don't think a guy's going to go from a 33% target share who's that talented to a 23% target share. And he's in an offense in Arizona where, depending on how you think this offense goes, there could be more targets available in Arizona than there were in Houston, just more pass attempts. And you guys had Pat Thorman on the Pace show, and there's a couple ways to interpret this, because the first month of the year last year, very up-tempo, very pass happy. It was a disaster. They didn't have the talent in place. They had to change things. They went run heavier with some success the last 3 months of the season. They slowed it down a little bit. Now, Pat's take seemed to be that worked. We could see more of that this year. My take is more what they wanted to do and what they tried to do in the first month of the season is what they want to do. And now that they have a DeAndre Hopkins, now that they've improved the offensive line, now that it's Kyler Murray's second year, they're going to try and do that. So even if you lower DeAndre Hopkins to 25% target share or so, he's going to see a ton of volume. He's going to get a ton of catches. I like him more in full PPR than half PPR because I could see some of the efficiency concerns there. But I just think he's going to get loaded up with receptions, maybe some shorter 8-out routes than we've seen from him in the past. That the floor there is huge. And if something happens to Kirk, Isabella's still, he's not going to see a meaningful target share. Larry Fitzgerald's getting a little bit dusty. I still see past him seeing 30% target share, even in an offense that's spread out.
You said Larry Fitzgerald's getting a little bit dusty. I think we've been down this path for a few years now. He's already dusted.
I was trying to be kind.
Okay, Evan, your rebuttal.
He's going to start hot because that's what Larry Fitzgerald does.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
He's going to start hot. That isn't going to help Hopkins, but he'll probably be holding out during that time period, anyways. When he does return from his holdout, I got to stop this. There was speculation that DeAndre Hopkins was holding out because he is known to be wanting a big contract extension, and he sat out a couple of days due to a tweaked hamstring, and then people started to speculate, oh, is he holding in? That's what players are doing, like Melvin Ingram and for the Chargers is holding in. But then Hopkins was back at practice yesterday, so I'll stop with those jokes. But the concerns for me regarding DeAndre Hopkins are number one, the history of wide receivers changing teams. John Paulson at 4 for 4 did a study on that. It's true that also RotoViz did a study on this recently, and wide receivers tend to lose production when they change teams. That should make sense intuitively because there's a level of chemistry and rapport there that needs to be established between a quarterback and his receiver. You listen to Kurt Warner talk, and he's like, hey, I played for a number of teams over the course of my career. Always it would take about 1 full year for me to really, for everything to really click in the passing game. So I think that there are some, just in terms of your process, there are some concerns there with being aggressively ranking or aggressively drafting DeAndre Hopkins there. I think there's a concern within your process if you're doing that. DeAndre Hopkins, over the last half decade, averaged 166 targets per game in Houston. And he really didn't have very much target competition in Houston. And although we think that Larry Fitzgerald is dusty, he's going to be out there running routes on every single play in the slot. And he's going to get, a number of targets, as is Christian Kirk, who until he got hurt last year, he was starting to come along. And I think that those two players are going to be the slot receivers in the Cardinals' 4 receiver sets. And it's going to take a different level of chemistry to be established between Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins, who's going to be on the outside 90-95% of the time. The way that DeAndre Hopkins plays, he's like a contested catch and a back shoulder receiver. And that, I think, requires chemistry between the quarterback and timing that needs to be established. And there's very little practice time. He's already missed some of the potential practice time. There are no preseason games. That's another concern. And it's purely a projection to say that all of a sudden the Cardinals are going to be, competing for the league lead in offensive pace or in offensive snaps because they were 18th last year and they weren't a good passing team last year. So you're also projecting a significant leap in terms of the play of Kyler Murray, who really wasn't a very good there's an argument to be made that Gardner Minshew, and I've seen this argument made, and it's backed by statistical evidence that Gardner Minshew was almost just as good of a passer as Kyler Murray was last year. So I think that there's a lot of hope and a lot of assumptions being made about DeAndre Hopkins this year, and I think it's going to take a little bit more time than people are anticipating. This was a great running team last year. They were top 10 in pure rushing yards. They were number 2 in rushing offense DVOA. They gave a transition tag to their running back Kenyon Drake. That's how they had success offensively last season. And I do think they're going to be a better passing team, but I don't think that they're going to be putting wide receivers in the top 5 in fantasy points this year. And I also think that Kyler Murray is being way overdrafted. His ADP is like quarterback 3. On FFPC, we have him at quarterback 7.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of Odell, where it seems like oh, no brainer. He's really talented. He's going to play with Baker, who's a rising star, and then next thing you know, it's like a total disaster. And I know that Odell suffered through injury, suffered through egregious offensive line play, suffered through egregious coaching, and maybe we won't see all that in Arizona. But yeah, I have in terms of rates, in terms of efficiency, Leone, I think I would have concerns there. And even if I would agree with you that 25% of the targets is probably right, but I would have efficiency concerns on DeAndre Hopkins beyond what we saw, even relative to what we saw with Odell last year. So, yeah.
Hermsmeyer had an article recently, or at least he retweeted an article recently from 538. And DeAndre Hopkins, and it was looking at separation rates among wide receivers. DeAndre Hopkins is not a separation receiver. So, I think that there's a level of chemistry that needs to be established between the quarterback and, or it just has to be like force feeding targets to DeAndre Hopkins, which is what happened with him in Houston for, year after year after year. And if you think about the way that like Mike Leach has talked about this. Okay. Mike Leach, of course, is the, Cliff Kingsbury is an offshoot of Mike Leach. Mike Leach does not view offensive balance as 50-50 run pass. He views it as an equal distribution of the football. Like you're getting all your playmakers involved. You're getting 5 or 6 guys involved. It's not force feeding the ball to one individual guy. That's what happened for the last 5 years with DeAndre Hopkins in Houston.
Yeah.
He's going to catch 90 balls, guys.
You said 90?
90?
Yeah. It's a lot of balls.
But yeah, I mean, we spent enough time on Nuke. I'll just say, I'll agree with you guys. I'll take Julio. I'll take Tyreek Hill. I'll take those guys over DeAndre Hopkins. But when you start to get to wide receiver 5, I'm probably still leaning on Nuke. And that's more, I think we agree the market's probably a little too high on him either way. But how far he falls down the rankings, I'm a little more optimistic.
That's one thing I wanted to ask about, because when I get back on the clock at the end of the second round, I don't really want DeAndre Hopkins. I don't really want Chris Godwin. I don't really love Aaron Jones. And I feel like at that back end of that second round, I'm like, God, this is just a mess right now. Kelsey and Kittle are already gone. And now what am I going to do? Have you found yourself in that spot, Leone, and what have you been doing in the back end of the second round?
Yeah, I have found myself in that spot. And I think the worst thing you could do is probably talk yourself into, I kind of defended Todd Gurley on Twitter. I don't know what got into me the other day, but I think the worst thing you could do is probably reach on a Todd Gurley type there. I've trusted our ETR rankings, and I've gone Juju Smith-Schuster and Amari Cooper at that turn. Even though it feels aggressive relative to their ADPs, we're really high on both those players. And I think I'm fine with just starting to bulk up on your receivers, even if it feels a little bit early. I think it's better than making a mistake just because, sometimes you're like, I like this guy, but it's too early. And then I think you force yourself into a mistake.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are asking themselves based on the rankings, Evan, like if you're using the rankings, a lot of times late second round, it's going to be staring you in the face, Juju and Amari. What have you been doing at the back end of the second round?
Hoping that I don't draft there. It stinks because that's where you're coming back to after you're starting with the bell cow backs that everybody wants. So it's like you just kind of hope that guys that you want fall to you there, and very often they don't, and you end up taking Godwin and Galladay or something like that, and it always feels too early.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk about the back end of the wide receiver tiers for a second. I think some people would say, wait a second now, wide receiver seems deep because these middle rounds are so outrageously strong, but there's actually a pretty sharp drop off after, say, round 10. And, there's some guys that I like. I don't know if you can still get Brandon Ayuk in round 10, probably not, but I would say Curtis Samuel, I would say N'Keal Harry, maybe Alan Lazard, Golden Tate you can get back there. But I'm curious if you've noticed, Evan, that like after round 10, maybe wide receiver isn't quite as deep. And you mentioned some guys that I'm okay with, like Paris Campbell and guys like that, but nobody I'm like super, super excited about at wide receiver in rounds 11, 12, 13, beyond the guys that I mentioned, Curtis Samuel, N'Keal Harry, Golden Tate, I guess I'm excited about, whatever. But yeah, is it as deep once we get into that 10, 11, 12, 13 round range?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are Steven Sims, Josh Reynolds. I mean, I'm sort of looking at this through a best ball lens, where you're really just trying to build, like a group at a position. In terms of guys that we're going to be using in redraft season long, no. I think I would rather be taking bench running backs in that range A guy like Chase Edmonds, who, by the way, I just boosted up big time in our rankings. He's not going to be a late round pick anymore. But no, I mean, I think that in those, 12, 13, 14th round, you're trying to build in a best ball draft. You're trying to build, wide receiver 5, 6, 7, 8. And I do think that there are a bunch of good guys to like add to your stable, like the Steven Simses and the Josh Reynolds. I think Mohamed Sanu is a guy who could get a lot of targets this year in New England. And he's like free in drafts. James Washington had a better season than I think any of us remember last year. I think he's going to probably have the highest ADOT and have a lot of air yards this year in Pittsburgh. So I think you're just trying to add to your stable, but looking at in a best ball draft there, but looking at season-long redraft, no, I mean, you don't want to be relying – if you're relying on any of these guys in a season-long redraft, you're probably in trouble.
Yeah, and that's the thing, Leone. It's like I want to have most, 3, 4, 5, 6 of my top wide receivers before round 10, because I kind of agree with the people that after round 10, maybe it's not quite as deep. Have you noticed that? And what do you attribute that to, if so?
Yeah, I think it's not quite as deep as it seems. It seems deeper in best ball because you don't have to pick when to start these guys and you can get some spiked weeks out of them. But, you're sitting there trying to decide when to start N'Keal Harry for a Patriots team that might be pretty run heavy, and, it could get dicey. And that's why I think in those rounds where we're saying to pound wide receivers, it's okay to take 1 or 2 of those guys for your bench even before you filled out your starting roster, because we get to round 10, all of a sudden we've got some running back candidates like Zach Moss and Chase Edmonds, who I've just mentioned, who we do love the upside on. And it's a lot easier to be taking one running back after another right there, before that tier drops off at running back. If you've already taken 4, 5, 6 wide receivers, if you are in, a weekly managed league and you're taking guys after round 10, I think you're really swinging for upside. If McCole Hardman lasts, a lot of the rookies, Laviska Shenault, Jalen Reagor, CeeDee Lamb, I think they all have significant upside, but the roles are a little bit shaky. But in a managed league, that's fine. You can afford to wait it out early in the season before, injuries and busts hit the guys that you took in the single-digit rounds.
Yep, exactly. I wanted to mention a couple other deep flyers. You mentioned Laviska Shenault. I think he's available in 13, 14, 15. I think it's fine. Andy Isabella, if you're in a deep league, like, I don't know, around 18 or so, like, it's not inconceivable for him to find a path and to be the player that, everybody thought he was when he got taken in the second freaking round. Evan mentioned Paris Campbell. I think that's an interesting one as well. Very, very late. Anybody I didn't mention that you guys like is just stone late round flyers for people in redraft leagues, just maybe some breaks between now and week 1 and they have something on their hands?
2 guys I like: Michael Pittman, same reasons you like Paris Campbell to an extent. If something happens to T.Y. Hilton, all of a sudden these guys are single digit round picks. They have to play. They're playing with a quarterback that, is getting a little dustier, but his YPA has been very strong the past few seasons. It's a dome team with a good offensive coordinator. And then also Josh Reynolds is a guy I've taken a lot at the end of drafts that doesn't seem very sexy for the Rams, but it feels like if anything happens to anyone on that offense, he's going to be thrust into a meaningful role. If Kupp goes down, if Woods goes down, if one of the tight ends goes down, and they start rolling these 3 wide receiver sets. So I think there are a lot of outs for Reynolds, even if it might not look great from day one.
Yeah, I'd throw Antonio Gandy-Golden into the mix, although that's really thin because I'm not sure he's even going to have a role to start the year. Anybody else at the back end of the draft at the wide receiver position, Evan?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with Leone's 2 guys. Of course, it looks like Paris Campbell, based on early camp reports, is already the Colts' number 2 receiver behind T.Y. Hilton. Because when T.Y. Hilton has gone out, Paris Campbell has stayed in there, and it's been like Zach Pascal or Pittman getting the first team run. So I think that Paris Campbell is like really locked into like he has job security. And I also think that the Rams are going to they're going to go back to playing 11 personnel like almost all the time this year. And Josh Reynolds is going to have that secure role. I don't even think he necessarily needs an injury. I think that they need him in the offense. He's their deep threat. They talked after the draft about one of the reasons that they Les Snead and Sean McVay were talking about they felt comfortable moving on from Brandon Cooks because they thought that Josh Reynolds could be their deep receiver. I mean, Robert Woods isn't a deep receiver. Cooper Kupp isn't a deep receiver. They need that deep element. Josh Reynolds is going to play a ton of snaps this year. Kendrick Bourne has become a lot more interesting. Hate drafting wide receivers that run 4.68, but Kendrick Bourne, like it looks like he might not come off the field very much early in the season, at least until Debo gets back, because the receivers in San Francisco just keep dropping like flies. But yeah, I mean, those are some guys that stand out.
Yeah, for sure. And we've talked about a ton of these late round guys. You can watch some of our draft replays. You can read the articles, Evan's team previews. Top 150, obviously, and all of our top 300 rankings are always updating to keep up with all the news. We don't want to get too much into player takes now, but I think we've outlined a good structure here for how we're handling the wide receiver position in drafts this year. We'll be back next time to wrap up this 4-part mini series to talk tight ends. So, for Leone, for Silva, for producer Luke, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.